And so they're spending tens of millions of dollars on carbon per year, and Patch is supporting them with that. And they're not going to tell anybody. They're going to tell maybe clients in RFPs or in RFP responses, but they're not going to publicize it, right? That's a very, very common pattern where some of our largest buyers, in some cases, don't even want to be cited in registries when they're actually retiring because they want to say, hey, we want to be able to use Patch for our accounting and we'll point to you guys for proof. But we don't even want to be publicized and we don't want to kind of be a beacon for the anti-woke kind of fighters out there, if you will. And so the strategy is staying the same, but particularly when it comes to communication, the tactics are really, really evolving.
Well, welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, and it's a pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Today we have with us Brennan Spellacy, co-founder and chief executive officer of Patch. And as usual, we have our weekly bestie, Rene Velasquez, co-founder and managing partner of Altera. And before we jump into some great topics and some of the major developments happening across the industry, I want to start by thanking Brennan for joining us today. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but first, I'd love to take a step back and hear more about your story, Brennan. And you've played a key role in building and managing Patch. So to kick things off, could you start by telling us a bit about your story and how Patch came to be and what inspired its creation and ultimately the impact that you're hoping to drive through the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Eddie, Rene, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to finally come on here. I've been watching the last couple of episodes over the last couple of weeks, so it's been fun to finally hop in the hot seat. So for those who aren't familiar with Patch, we build an end-to-end platform to help large enterprises build and execute their carbon credit strategies. So we really both have kind of technology, expertise, and data that come together that help some of the largest carbon buyers in the world, like Bain & Company, like Workday, like JP Morgan, build their carbon credit strategies, understand what's out in the market, what does quality look like, but as well as what is the right way to buy, spot, futures, offtake, etc. So it's not just the kind of underlying climate science, but it's also the kind of financial and economic context. And then we help them actually source, diligence, and transact all in one place. Business is 5 years old. Founded the company back in April of 2020, right at the onset of COVID. And Patch is really kind of a confluence of a couple of my past experiences. So while I've been working in technology the last decade or so, I'm formally educated in chemical engineering. Really wanted to work in low carbon energy. That's how I thought I was fighting climate change. And that didn't work out. Only got jobs in oil and gas coming out of school. I studied at McGill, so the tar sands or the oil sands were incredibly popular back in kind of the early 2010s. I did not want to do that. And so instead, I became a programmer. I had a really fantastic opportunity to be an early developer at Shopify and a few other technology companies that ended me out in San Francisco. And it wasn't until February, March of 2020 that my co-founder, Aaron Grunfeld, and I decided that we wanted to do something of our own. And we really wanted to bring things back to climate. So how could we kind of merge this kind of chemical engineering and kind of software platform building that we had done over the last decade? And when we looked at the 10 or 11 things that need to be true in order for us to hit our climate goals, one of those was the new kind of budding environmental commodities, whether it's carbon dioxide removal, sustainable aviation fuel, biodiversity markets. There are all these kind of small budding markets that needed to go from, in some cases, non-existent or very, very small to $500 billion to $1 trillion in scale by 2050 in order to hit our climate ambition. I think there are two problems with that. The first is kind of scaling and managing the hard costs, the cost of actually development of these new technologies. What Patch aims to solve, and the kind of vision is how do we also manage the soft costs that come with information complexity, right? So when you're doing KYC, moving millions of dollars around, understanding how to do programmatic diligence on who your counterparties are, the thing you're actually buying, if you want a market to go from a couple billion, like voluntary carbon is today, to hundreds of billions, you need to actually have these pieces of software infrastructure, these platforms that help buyers and sellers understand what's happening. And that's what we're aiming to do. So the longer term ambition of Patch is not to focus just on carbon. It's actually to be what we describe as multi-market, to support folks with sustainable aviation fuel, with carbon removal, with carbon avoidance, with eventually compliance markets. But our wedge has been voluntary carbon. And so today we really operate as a kind of the marquee end-to-end procurement partner and try to be an extension of the office of the CSO and the CFO.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing. That's great story. And I know we work with Patch, and we love the team there. So it's doing some great things over there. So
Appreciate it.
shifting gears a little bit. Yeah, yeah, no worries. Shifting gears. I want to address the obvious elephant in the room, right? Which is this current U.S. political climate and rising economic pressures from tariffs and trade tensions, and overall a very hostile stance from Washington towards net zero policies, right? And you recently had a piece that I read, or a brief piece published in African Business, where you made a really powerful point that this administration is just a moment in time compared to the long-term problem of climate change. And you emphasize that the most business leaders and sustainability officers plan to be around a lot longer than 4 years, right? And despite the political noise, you're actually seeing an uptick in corporate appetite for carbon offset credits, and companies actually realizing now that offsetting will have to be a part of their solutions, right? So I'd love to unpack that a little bit more and hear your take on the impact that this political environment might have on the voluntary carbon market, and how you're seeing U.S. corporates balancing short-term political headwinds with long-term sustainability commitments. Would love to hear
Yeah,
your take on that.
happy to dive in. Well, look, I mean, first things first, Rene's showing why we're all doing this, right? It's for the future here.
You guys didn't
So
see that
it's
in the
good. It's always
background. I had my daughter
that's
just
right. It's
come and
always
visit
good to
us.
be good to be grounded in what we're fighting for here. But yeah, I mean, Eddie, look, like, and this is what I've said to the Patch team. The a well, prior to the current administration, a Biden administration and a hypothetical Harris administration would have been more positive, at least from a market vibes perspective, for carbon removal and the voluntary carbon market broadly, certainly. But when you actually look underneath the microscope over the last 4 years, it wasn't outside of 45Q and a few other tax credits associated for very specific technologies. There actually wasn't a huge amount of policy tailwind for the voluntary carbon market, at least within the United States. There was a Treasury and DOE joint kind of announcement or kind of endorsement of the market broadly. But outside of that, it wasn't as if there were huge incentives driving corporates to invest within this market. And so the real question is, how are folks going to react today, right? Are they going to use this as an opportunity to delay the implementation of strategies they've already kind of put into motion? Or are they going to just change the tactics on the field? What we see is we're seeing a lot more of the latter, where when I speak to CSOs or CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, the common message is, look, we have a 10-year plan. It's longer than any administration, even if you do 2 terms in a row. So we can't be flailing around with the current flavor of the day, if you will, right? Political flavor of the day. We have to kind of continue marching towards where we're heading, in this case, towards net zero, because a lot of organizations view it as a systemic or a systemic risk to their business. But the tactics they are using are changing, right? I've had two CSOs tell me today, we have a bit of press coming out next week that they, in writing, said they have a green hushing policy. And so they're spending tens of millions of dollars on carbon per year, and Patch is supporting them with that. And they're not going to tell anybody. They're going to tell maybe clients in RFPs or in RFP responses, but they're not going to publicize it, right? That's a very, very common pattern where some of our largest buyers, in some cases, don't even want to be cited in registries when they're actually retiring, because they want to say, hey, we want to be able to use Patch for our accounting, and we'll point to you guys for proof. But we don't even want to be publicized, and we don't want to kind of be a beacon for the anti-woke kind of fighters out there, if you will. And so the strategy is staying the same, but particularly when it comes to communication, the tactics are really, really evolving.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, you're seeing companies basically saying we don't want to be known for, investing in or retiring carbon offset credits, right? I like that. The green hushing. That's very interesting. Rene, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's actually so. Brennan, again, congratulations on your journey and the success that you guys have achieved. It's really fantastic to see in such a short period of time, and so really proud of you as an entrepreneur in the space and as a leader and thought leader in the space, and grateful for you to be on the podcast. As yeah, to answer that question, Eddie, yeah, it's actually it's great that you're calling that out, Brennan. I've seen this for a very long time as well, even at the apex of the market, that a lot of companies just don't want to necessarily be in the spotlight, and the registries obviously recognize that by having these non-public or anonymous retirements, right? You can choose whether you want to disclose publicly or whether you want to remain private. Like you, we facilitated, institutionally and historically in terms of our institutional memory. And as you said, I've got a little guest guest speaker here in the background, as you guys can see, my daughter Valentina. Who have, back to the clients piece, who have actually retired historically, but done so in a very hush way. So this green hushing kind of nomenclature makes a lot of sense and does resonate. It is sad that that's the case, because essentially we come back to this paradigm of taking voluntary action and that somehow it not being ever enough, right? To some folks on one side, like on the left, and then folks on the right being too much and too woke, right? So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And that just doesn't compute with what you said. We have a huge problem. We need to start to channel finance in order to address this energy transition broadly, and it needs to be measured in trillions of dollars. And unless we have the tools and systems and platforms like yours, right, and exchanges and like, but as long if we don't have the demand signal that is focused and pointed in that direction, we get this stasis that we find ourselves in broadly, or we get this perversity of this, resilience of underlying market that we keep hearing stories of folks like that are doing analysis in the market and going, why is the underlying sort of 100 million tons a year still the case? It's because clients like yours are doing what you're saying, staying hushed and silent. So that's the thoughts on that. Eddie, do you mind if I just kind of opine also on the broader sort of geopolitical headwinds, as you kind of labeled it, I believe, and also the kind of monetary and fiscal policy landscape? Because we've taken a couple of weeks off, and because we were traveling, and we'll have some interesting stuff and content coming up from the European Climate Summit in Lisbon a couple of weeks ago, and then I was away on school holidays for a week, and we've come back, and it's a completely changing global paradigm. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just
definitely
focus.
I think that's
cool. So one of the big stories that occurred over the last few days, right? Like I won't rehash for people's kind of avoidance of boredom, the whole trade policy inversion that's occurred since Liberation Day. But I want to talk about the U.S. Fed, in particular Chair Powell's comments recently, and the markets in terms of financial markets, and carbon is one such subset, are operating in this kind of now really sort of a high degree of uncertainty context. And Chairman Powell noted that essentially the scale of the tariffs was significantly larger than anticipated. And that I think is really important. And because if you think about it from a monetary policy perspective, the central banks like the Fed chair, like the Fed, for example, their abilities to essentially increase or decrease rates in order to spur or constrain inflation, so spur economic impact or curb inflation. But with increasing tariffs, effectively we've got an economic impact that could be actually significantly larger than expected, but ultimately can actually lead to a rise in inflation. And interestingly, and these things tend to move inversely in terms of correlation, but that could actually slow economic growth and increase unemployment at the same time of an increasing inflation environment. And that essentially hamstrings, and I'm obviously putting words in the Fed's mouth here, but it hamstrings their ability to decrease rates, which the market had initially priced, last year, this continuous sort of monetary easing, and that now leads to this weird situation that we find ourselves in, unless there's a reversal with regards to the trade, tariffs. So it's a really interesting time to be in the market. And that's just the broader context. But I do think, to Brennan's earlier point, and the silver lining is that this is just a moment in time. And although there's increasing volatility and a lot of concern in terms of traders' minds, this too shall pass, right? We've seen this before. We've seen other things that have happened that are seismic, but this too shall pass. And we're looking over time scales. The thing that I come back to in terms of my view, and I think that there's a precedence, and then I'll stop talking, is this is not the first Trump administration, and we've seen very, let's say, erratic or unplanned, or maybe not well communicated sort of policy directions. And as you said, Brennan, the democratic alternative over the last 4 years hasn't been that symmetry to voluntary carbon markets. And ironically, in Trump's first term, we saw that this policy retreat away from net zero sort of support actually created a vacuum, and the voluntary market came in and filled that vacuum. The best 4 years in the voluntary carbon markets actually happened under a Trump administration. And I think that this kind of vacuum that's been created with regards to challenges around DEI and certainly environment and carbon markets can actually be filled through voluntary action at the corporate level. And then to Brennan, your final point around 10-year plans, and sometimes even longer for large Fortune 500 businesses and others, they have to look beyond these kind of headwinds. And there's an opportunity within every crisis. So that's the kind of context that we kind of find ourselves in. My question to you guys is, how do you see it in terms of voluntary participation within this kind of new paradigm that we face ourselves in today, Brennan? And your thoughts, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. The thing that's, you mentioned a vacuum of leadership, right? And I think there's two elements. There's how do you get to a particular outcome, right? So whether it's net zero or not. But then I think if you take a step back, it's who's setting the standard, or who's setting the standard what good looks like. And so I do think there is also an opportunity for the standard setters, the SBTIs and the VCMIs of the world, to actually potentially fill that vacuum as well. Even as recently as this last New York Climate Week, I had several conversations with CSOs who said, look, the pathway for us, a very specific airline said this to me, where they said the pathway to us to net zero is very simple. It's going to be about 1/3 through operational efficiency and kind of retrofitting our fleet incrementally. It's going to be 1/3 through sustainable aviation fuel, and it's going to be 1/3 through CDR. And if SBTI doesn't let us do that, we have to pull out. Plain and simple. It's like we've run every model, we've run every approach. This is the best we can do. If we want to be net zero by 2050, this is how SAF's going to scale. This is the production rate of Airbus and Boeing, which, by the way, can only produce a couple thousand planes between the two of them per year. And if you have 50,000 wide-body jets in circulation, it's going to take 40 or 50 years to rotate the entire fleet out, right? And then we're going to need carbon dioxide removal. And so I do think there's also this opportunity of, when you look at the voluntary climate action ecosystem in itself, it in some cases struggles to get out of its own way, where there's a huge amount of dogma and the exact path and how we're going to get there. And that's very common. That's kind of both the opportunity and the risk, I think, over the next 4 years. Because if you imagine a world where we say, hey, we're actually going to allow for scope 3 and maybe scope 1 to be addressed by some percentage with carbon dioxide removal, and we're going to basically allow people to have some sort of flexibility in figuring out how to get to that goalpost, to that net zero goal mark, or kind of a 2030 intermediate goal, then I think there's an opportunity for this market to actually flourish really effectively. But if you simply say, no, you must go a very particular way, and cost of capital remains high, and in some cases getting hooked up to renewable energy in parts of Europe, there's a 5, 6, 7-year waiting list in some countries, we're going to miss. And so I think the question is, like, how flexible do the standard setters want to be? Because that's what a lot of these corporates are looking to in the absence of regulation, because they view the SBTIs and PDPs of the world as kind of the pseudo regulator, and they assume that regulators are going to eventually adopt their body of work. And so if it's not even clear what those folks are going to end up either, it's just too much uncertainty, right? You can't intelligently deploy capital as a corporate if you don't know roughly where the goalposts are going to be. And literally every goalpost is moving, right? tariffs are moving, what net zero looks like is moving, where kind of human capital and immigration is going to look like, not just in the US, right? Western Europe generally is going through kind of this like right left divide as well. And so it's very, very difficult for CSO, CFO, CEOs to make any sort of intelligent long range decision because there's so much uncertainty. And so I think if we get that figured out, it's going to be really hard, I think, right? Versus in the dynamic you were describing, Rene. Yes, it was the first Trump presidency, but it was also everyone was coming off the high of the of Paris, right, in 2015.
Yeah.
And so there was like a huge amount of like collective gusto. That is not the world we are in right now. 10 years later, there's a huge amount of confusion, and everyone's kind of looking around to say who's gonna pick up the baton here, because what a lot of people viewed as, where I live in the United States, a lot of people viewed us as a leader in a lot of contexts, and that reputation has been vaporized in less than 100 days. And so the question is, what now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's actually, thank you for that. That's really interesting. Can I just give a couple of reflections on that, especially to that last piece around, this time it's different because you're absolutely right. We had this perfect conflation of these two forces, market forces and kind of political forces in 2020 and 21, obviously with the pandemic in the broader context. But like you said, we came from Paris Agreement, in 2015, and then ultimately we got to Glasgow, right? And that was the kind of now the implementation piece. Now we've got the rule book for Article 6, which took a long time to effectively implement, and then you had this kind of the approach. Right. And you had the celebration and an opportunity here for multilateralism. And then you had the Greta Thunberg effect of civil society effectively providing pressure. And then you had, fiscal and financial pressures, in terms of support at the BlackRocks of the world and pressures that they put on boards, et cetera. So you had this perfect confluence. Today, like you said, we find ourselves in a very radically changing political, but also just social kind of context. And in the kind of geopolitical space, there's this shift away from multilateralism to unilateralism. So that is the big wild card. But to your point, I think that there are really bright spots, and I think that companies, because they drive such a key component of the economy, like they're the drivers of economy, and they recognize that they can't operate within a carbon limitless world, that there is inherently a carbon limit, and that they're feeling the constraints, whether they be in their supply chains in terms of agricultural exposed companies. They see that in particular, whether you're in aviation and you see increase in emissions, or a constraint, like you said, with regards to capital or the scale of deployment of a lot of these technologies like sustainable aviation fuels, that just find it very difficult to scale with the current kind of delta or spreads between the cost of Jet A and SAF. And so it's interesting, and voluntary markets can play a catalytic role in helping to effectively underwrite those capex investments by effectively closing that spread. And I think that's an inherent opportunity. So Eddie, sorry, I'll hand it back to you because I know you had a kind of a transition piece.
No worries. I think, just before we jump into the next kind of story, I think you did mention a good point on SBTI, and they're kind of, they've been flip-flopping their stance on the use of, carbon removal for residual emissions. So I guess I want to ask, do you think the SBTI stance and the uncertainty is preventing corporate sustainability teams from taking action today, and it's delaying, sustainability initiatives? What kind of impact do you think it's having? And almost, it's from the corporate sustainability folks that I've spoken to, there's a lot of confusion, right? With, VCMI and ICBCM and SBTI and, climate change certification standards, and different in each jurisdiction. There seems to be a lot of complexity and confusion that's delaying action. Well, let's get your take on this real quick before we shift gears.
No, absolutely. So I think the reality is, like, when you are a Fortune 500 CSO, that's who we spend most of our time with, right? So organizations that are doing tens of billions of dollars plus of revenue per year. These are fairly sophisticated organizations. And so a lot of them, to Rene's point, see the writing on the wall. And they say, okay, we can't operate in a infinite carbon environment forever. Okay, great. That's what's going to drive some of the decarbonization. And what we've seen to date is a lot of the kind of what I would describe as easy decarbonization, which is decarbonization that aligns with cost cutting, typically comes pretty easily, right? We're going to travel less. We're going to waste less food. We're going to waste less any sort of input material. That comes incredibly easily, right? But there is also the kind of, okay, what's going to happen after that? Well, the thing that comes after that is CapEx, right? And I was speaking to this one CSO who works in agriculture a couple of weeks ago, and she said the first 20% was so easy. It was, we're going to do more Zoom, we're going to travel less, we're going to sell the corporate jet, we're going to get rid of those. That's great. But now the next 20% is going to come with a $10 billion CapEx outlay, and my rates are like 3 times what they were 3 or 4 years ago. And that was before the tariff situation. Right. So I don't know how she's feeling right now. It's probably a lot worse because a lot of those products that she's moving around the world are affected. And so then there's a huge amount of execution risk in what I would describe as the one perfect pathway to net zero. Right. So this is something we have a conversation all the time, which is no, we want to purely decarbonize and then invest in carbon removal last. And the carbon removal will happen in 2030, maybe it'll happen in 2035, maybe it'll happen in 2040. And what people are beginning to realize is 2 things. The first is, well, wait, deploying 10, 15, $20 billion of CapEx in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years has a huge amount of risk associated with it. Before even being able to raise the capital or get access to that financing and finance particular assets, right, regardless of what geography you might be or industry you might be operating within, there's also the idea of, can you simply deploy it to do the thing you want it to do? Whether it's replacing boilers with heat pumps, whether it's deploying renewable energy, whether it's rolling out an electric vehicle fleet, there's a huge amount of risk associated with that, right? I believe it was IKEA who had a really audacious delivery goal, probably one of the most forward-thinking organizations when it comes to decarbonization, and they even missed their intermediate target when it came to their vehicle electrification goals, and they kind of just did a public retrospective on it recently. So the average company is operating at a lot less operational rigor than IKEA is, given the global scale. There's a huge amount of risk. And I think that's actually where carbon dioxide removal comes in, because one, there's going to be that like last 10 or 20% residual, but then it's also the insurance policy, right? Where if we misallocate, if we misstep, which is going to happen, right? Not all organizations in the world, not all 50 gigatons are going to be decarbonized exactly how we expect it to. Carbon removal is your pressure release valve. Carbon abatement is your pressure release valve, right? And so if that's your pressure release valve and that's your insurance policy, why would you try to start getting access to your insurance policy right when everyone else is trying to get it in 2030 or 2035? Right, when everyone's trying to run for the door. Because now these organizations also understand there is an industrial policy problem. It takes time to scale up, whether it's a direct air carbon capture facility, whether it's enhanced rock weathering or biochar, or even reforestation. All these things take time, whether it's industrial development or photosynthesis, right? And so they know they need some lead time, which is what's actually driving a lot of incentives to invest in the short term. The problem is that they don't know what to invest in because they don't know what the pseudo regulator in SBTI or the actual regulator in the United States, EU, et cetera, are going to endorse. And that's the rock in the hard place. And that's where people are getting really, really stuck. And so what we're seeing, at least at Patch, is a lot of people are investing, but they're spreading their a smaller amount of capital that they want to be investing over a lot of different options. So they're doing a huge amount of hedging right now, where they're saying, okay, I need to probably be investing 10 million a year. Well, I'm going to invest 2 million a year and spread it over 10 options. And for an organization like Patch, that's fine, right? Because we essentially were able to monetize off the quantum that's invested. But for project developers, it means you got to stock a lot of buyers on top of each other. If everyone's kind of putting in just 5 or 10% of their budget into a particular solution, it makes it really, really hard to get to scale for them. And so it creates this weird, like anemic growth loop where even if you see in growing enterprise investment, it's not really at the velocity it ought to be. Compared to 5 years ago, it's growing and that's fantastic. But we're in the 50 or $100 billion problem zone, not in the $10 billion problem zone. And so we need a kind of, the financial implication of the cost structure is there in a lot of cases. It's just a matter of simply, I want to make sure I don't put my $50 million bet on the wrong number. And so we have to drive a little bit of clarity there. So it's absolutely, I mean, it's really interesting because I basically will have I've had the same conversation a dozen times, which is we need to invest 10 million a year, but SBTI is unclear. So what we're going to do is we're going to invest like 2 now and pay the price later, because I'd rather pay a premium tomorrow than put all my eggs in the wrong basket today. And so this is my like 1 foot in, 1 foot out dynamic. That's not good. We got to fix that. Everyone acknowledges the climate science. Everyone knows their business. It's not going to be able to decarbonize at the same rate, but the climate ecosystem is getting in their own way in some cases.
Yeah, there's just a lot of risk tied to a lot of carbon projects, and corporates most of the time aren't willing to front that risk. It's not really their role. It's the role for venture capitalists and financiers. But very well said with regards to SBTI. I completely agree, and I think on the geopolitical landscape, there's a great news story for once. A great news story in the VCM that actually just came out today. And it's that the UK government has backed, major support and showed major support for the voluntary carbon market, right? And with many companies that are falling short on their Scope 3 emissions targets, the UK government steps in and it issues clear support for the temporary use of high integrity voluntary credits to help their corporates meet their indirect emissions goals, right? And as part of this 12-week consultation, the UK government has proposed formally adopting 2 major private sector frameworks, which is the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, and their Claims Code of Practice, and the ICVCM, so the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and their Core Carbon Principles label. And these frameworks are set to be integrated into their domestic policy, which offers a strong vote of confidence into high integrity climate claims and potentially setting a new global blueprint for how voluntary credits can complement climate targets and sustainability solutions, right? And on top of that, to ensure quality, the UK government's also proposing that all credits must carry the ICVCM CCP stamp, the Core Carbon Principle stamp. And they're also proposing legislation or guidance to set minimum buyer standards, requirements for companies to publicly disclose barriers to emissions reductions when using credits, and time limits on how long interim claims can be made. So that certainly raises the bar on what counts as credible, while also deepening transparency with the use of offsets. So, I think with that being said, this is a major announcement in the industry, especially from a government like the UK, to formally endorse integrity frameworks in the VCM, like the VCMI and ICVCM. So do you think this could mark a turning point in the mainstream of voluntary carbon markets? And do you see this becoming, a template that other countries might adopt? What are your initial thoughts on this coming out of the UK?
Can I take this one?
Yeah, please go for it.
Cool. So look, obviously, like you said, Eddie, this announcement came in overnight. So I think, our market certainly hasn't had time to digest it fully. And obviously we've got these long weekend. But in terms of a quick reflection on it, I think, and Brennan, I love how you phrase it with like the pseudo regulators, and it's, pointing to SBTI sitting in that framework. And if they don't do it, then the real regulators will. This is a perfect example of that itself. Sure. And the UK essentially recognizing that they have a responsibility to, again, fill that void created by the absence of leadership that's occurring on your side of the Atlantic. But as it relates to this announcement and obviously this 12-week consultation, I kind of see it as 3 buckets. Effectively, they're looking to strengthen the voluntary carbon market and nature markets, and by providing this endorsement around integrity, end-to-end integrity initiative that's been created by VCMI and the ICVCM. And I think that is fantastic, because it now gives, again, that tacit endorsement to participate, so that we avert that perversion of the scenario that you just mentioned, Brennan, with like, okay, here's our intention, we want to invest, but we're going to hold back on our investment because we'd rather not invest in the wrong thing, right? In this case, it's saying, well, here's what you can invest in, and this is what we will recognize. So that's fantastic. The second one's like, yeah, introducing those principles effectively, right? Like after the consultation, that the government will provide this framework of those guiding principles to ensure that the credits that are used, they're used appropriately and responsibly in order to effectively promote those corporate climate strategies, and then substantiating those claims, and ultimately then it helps to unlock economic opportunities and drive the clean energy transition piece. So maybe that's, a third and a fourth kind of component, but it's actually really good because the UK, as a result of that, continues then to promote itself as a green, like, and technology and investment hub, right? Which helps them to actually see this challenge around decarbonization, but actually see it as an opportunity to actually grow their economy through stimulating investment, and then the positive effects that has in terms of jobs creation and broader economic growth. So that's kind of my quick sort of overview on it, but I think it's really stimulatory and a positive announcement. Brennan, love to hear your thoughts.
No, I mean, look, first of all, like, Mark Kenber is a good friend. He's the executive director of BCMI. He's been fighting a good fight a long time.
Sure.
And we have a couple patch clients that have made VCMI claims, including Bain, which they were quite public about. And so just really happy to see, like, I think it's a big win for him and that organization, because they've been slugging it up for a long time, and I think it's good to see a bit of momentum. I mean, I think it's a perfect example of the roadmap I was describing, right? And it is a bit interesting as well, right? We mentioned this idea of there's one acronym not in that mix, right? It's SBTI, right? You have VCMI and ICBCM in the mix, who've been focused a little bit more on perhaps like rapid iteration, is what I'll describe it as, and iterating towards the right solution. And for the time being, there's no blessing of the SBTI framework within the context of the UK. Now, I think there is one thing that's actually very interesting about the announcement, which is this idea of focusing on core carbon principle projects. We at Patch, it's very easy to understand which projects get the CCP label from ICBCM. So that's fairly clear within the platform. To date, we have not seen a particularly large pricing premium. There are a few clients that really, really care about it, but it's a bit of a mixed bag, actually. I think it's a little bit less of it took so long for the ICBCM to get where it was. I remember I was on some of the initial plenary during COVID, when it was the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, I believe is what it was called back then.
That's exactly right.
And it was these 200 or 300 person Zooms, and it was chaos, and McKinsey was trying to like keep the wheels on the bus, and Mark Carney was in and out, and he's had like 5 jobs since. And so, like, I think there was a little bit of like uncertainty on, is there a there with the ICBCM? So it's really amazing to see kind of the UK kind of apply their stamp of approval. Now, I think the thing that's interesting, though, is this idea of, okay, if you're applying a large demand signal or this integrity standard, which historically has not been particularly sought out, at least from our perspective, that's going to drive the demand up, at least in the context of the UK, right? And about a third of our business is in the UK. So you mentioned this idea of stimulating job creation. Passion's at least created about 20 jobs in the UK, so it's working for us. It's bringing us to the region, and we've been in the market before, and we'll have to probably hire there a little bit more as well. So it's helping at least bring American venture capital into the UK. So there's that. But I think there's also this question of showing proof of why you cannot decarbonize. And my hypothesis, I'm not privy to any kind of non-public information there, but my hypothesis is that that's so that people don't fall into this common trope of paying to go about your business as usual is a common example, right? So you can pay a much lower price than it actually takes to do the hard work of decarbonizing your business. That's a misaligned incentive. I think the big question I have is that going to be actually an unnecessary burden? Because if you have a world where there's actually a very small subset of supply that's deemed high integrity, presumably that price is going to go up, at least in the context of those jurisdictions, which means instead of the marginal cost of abatement might not be $10, $15, or $20, might getting be closer to 40, 50, 60, 70, in which case it make more sense to decarbonize instead of invest in carbon markets. And so when you add this extra, again, like drag to investing, it's unclear to me what that piece serves, actually, right? Historically, I understand why you would need that because there was no indication or blessed standard and it was a little bit unclear. But in a world where a lot of people are running for the door for a certain amount of supply, that price is going to come up and equalize. And there are going to be some markets or organizations that can afford that price and it makes sense to do. And there will be some organizations where it doesn't make sense to do and they should just purchase a virtual power purchase agreement or develop renewable energy or something similar. And I think that's the one piece that kind of I keyed in on that I like less. I tend to be a little bit more of a Ezra Klein abundance type mentality. We have fewer roles, make it easier to build and deploy capital, and have a few lines to color within, but just as few as you need. But that, I know it's not a universally kind of common perspective.
Yeah, well, very well said. Rene, do you have any take on that?
Yeah, no, it's really good points, Brennan. I think I like how you framed it around having fewer lines or colors to sort of color with. I do want to commend the ICBCM and VCMI. I think that they've done a great job. It's interesting, as from a trader's perspective, when you were speaking, I was just thinking about where's the trade opportunity, right? But like to your point around, there hasn't been a sort of a basis spread to the upside for CCP credits just yet. I think it's just a timing issue. I think that it will. What it's creating is essentially a signal to the market around where investment should occur. And so we'll see an increasing pool of supply around CCP eligible projects. We're certainly seeing that as we go upstream, where project developers are looking for that stamp of approval, right? Like you don't see investment going into projects that are clearly not within the eligible scope of CCP sort of framework. So today, there's no spread, but I think that increasingly the liquidity sits within this CCP framework. And then increasingly, when we look 5, 10, 20 years ahead, it's only going to be CCP. That's like the floor. That's like the reset around the market. So we get this natural cleaning out and then kind of push forward. To your point, though, it's going to be very interesting in terms of how the price dynamics actually do materialize. I see a dislocation with regards to our current structure today, and then an eventual increase in demand catalyzed by whatever things you can think about, right? If SBTI as the pseudo regulator does change their stance and allow for that, then essentially they open up the supply spigot and flow will come in terms of demand. But our current infrastructure and current delays in the processing and deployment of capital, you talked about an execution risk, right? Around the pure decarbonization strategy and betting all your eggs on that kind of approach is inherently weak, and you need to have an insurance policy. I think you kind of called the CDR piece. I like that, but inherently as well for actual the CDR and even just avoidance credits, there's a deployment and execution risk as well, and I kind of worry about the ramp up of how quickly we can reach the scale on that side, given that when you put either trees on the ground, like you said, in terms of photosynthesis, that inherently takes time, or whether you're putting factories in the ground and et cetera, all occurring within this higher cost of capital kind of world that we live in. And that leads to one outcome, if you game theory this out, which is this journey towards net zero, right? And we've set this target of 2050 and then interim targets of 2030. Those are not realistic. And I think we need to recognize those. And your point around IKEA earlier was really salient. I love that video that they did where they addressed it head on, and they said, hey, we came up with this ambition to basically electrify our fleet, and despite our best efforts, we haven't actually achieved that goal, but that's okay. Like, we recognize that this is a journey and it's not the destination, but we're doing everything that's possible, and we want to come out and kind of call it out. And I think that's leadership to me, right? But it shows that, hey, this is a hard thing to do, decarbonization. So anyway, just some reflections. I'm not sure if I addressed the question.
No, you certainly did, and very well said. But overall, great news coming out of the UK. I particularly found it interesting with their plan to mandate disclosures of barriers to emissions reductions when using credits. I thought that was an interesting one. No, but we could probably dive into that, for the next few hours. So I think it'd be good to, shift over to another great news story in the voluntary market, and global carbon compliance systems as well. So, as we've seen last week, the International Maritime Organization reached an historic agreement to introduce a global carbon pricing mechanism for shipping, and which is one of the most hard to abate sectors, right? And there are two tiers of targets with baseline reductions of up to 43% by 2035. And it includes a global fuel standard to reduce emissions intensity and a new carbon pricing system that will require vessels emitting above certain thresholds to acquire remedial units, right? So effectively paying for their excess emissions. And the price of these units for ships to comply are $100 a ton for tier 1, which is the less strict tier, and $380 a ton for tier 2. And the compliance mechanism enters into force in 2027 and applies to all vessels globally above 5,000 tons. So this covers 85% of global shipping emissions, which is significant, right? And the IMO is still evaluating whether high integrity carbon credits will be allowed to, enter this system and meet compliance obligations. So definitely stay tuned in that regard. But, just right off the bat to dive in, I'd love to hear your initial thoughts on this development from the IMO. We've seen one hard to abate sector, aviation, that has, a net zero goal with compliance mechanism, Corsia. And now we're seeing another compliance mechanism emerge in global shipping, two of the, hardest to abate sectors in the world, shipping and aviation. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts. And, if this signals a broader shift towards global compliance, carbon pricing mechanisms.
More
Go for it,
strike
Rene.
on that grenade. You want me to do it? Okay. Yeah, look, I think great call out there, Eddie. It is a great story because essentially, even though there's not a direct opportunity, let's say from our lens of the carbon markets in terms of the trading and facilitating the trade of carbon units, it nonetheless, the IMO has come out here with essentially an implicit carbon price, and it attaches this monetary cost to carbon emissions, but only above this certain emissions intensity threshold. And I think that that's really, really good. And to your point, essentially, it shows the different approaches that are taken by different industries, even though they're both hard to abate and both in transportation. You contrast the ICAO approach versus the IMO approach, so aviation versus shipping. Within aviation, you've got these 4 core pillars, right? Operational efficiency, technological efficiency, sustainable aviation fuels, and then carbon markets as this kind of pressure release valve. I'm stealing that one, Brennan, from the previous comment that you made earlier. And the potential for Corsia is kind of well understood in the carbon markets, and a lot of investments going into to kind of create a pipeline of supply to meet that ultimate demand. However, the IMO's change sort of tack, excuse the pun here from a shipping kind of analogy, but they've decided to go with regards to a fuel standard and then create effectively an interesting kind of cap and trade model where effectively they're setting these implicit targets and incentivizing those fleets that actually can transition to lower emissions intensity fuels. But nonetheless, it's a real monetary cost and a penalty for high emitters. And I think that's a really good thing. And you'll start to then see that price signal around that price and that externality then find its way through into the global economy. So that's fascinating to me, and I think that we need to commend that. I think the broader context, and obviously we've been in and around within ICAO, we've had a front seat. It was there in Montreal in 2016 when that system was adopted, and prior to it, as the market-based mechanism was effectively being debated, and we kind of played a role in terms of educating capacity building. So that's great. At the IMO, a little bit kind of further back, but what's watching that, and I think we speak to a lot of obviously airlines, but also folks in maritime, and they have different problems with regards to decarbonization. Aviation, and Brennan, you mentioned this earlier. The changing of the fleet is a 30 to 50 year problem because of the constraints with regards to the new planes coming on, and essentially now you get retrofitting and kind of operational efficiencies for the older fleet, but nonetheless your fuel efficiency decreases at a very sort of tempered rate, and nonetheless the emissions continue to increase if there's more flights. But technologically, it's really, really hard to upgrade and make significant changes apart from weight reductions and kind of winglets and other sort of things like that. And you can have efficiencies with regards to scheduling and other things, but they're incremental gains. But you can't kind of change the energy mix of a plane. The physics just don't stack up. You can't just switch the fuel mix and go, and this is what SAF is trying to do, replace the same molecule from a renewable source, but you can't just, flick a magic wand or whatever and a switch and then say, bada boom, we've got hydrogen planes. The energy density just doesn't occur, and you can't do that. So that's their constraints. Within shipping, however, they've actually got other levers, because as opposed to having to defy the laws of physics and generate thrust to get off the ground and operate at a high altitude, you're going across the oceans, but you've got these huge tankers with large volume and actual surface areas. They can, and I think with these kind of price signals, and they're not accidental, they're deliberate in terms of signals, in order to catalyze and underwrite the capex investments in order to do the shift with regards to the energy mixes. We talked to a number of large shipping companies that are saying it's very hard under the let's say current dynamic up until this system comes into place in October, to justify those capex expenditures to do that energy shift, right? So if I'm gonna retrofit or even buy new tankers, etc. But even if I'm going to retrofit and change it to LNG, it's going to be really expensive, and then they have a sort of a hurdle price of at least $60 to $80 a ton. Now having this $100 a ton implicit price imposed by this is actually going to be catalytic to driving, I think, the improvement around the fleet efficiency. So that's really, really good, and we need to commend that. Hopefully there is a realization that carbon markets could play again a role in that context. And if that happens, then fantastic, because as Brennan said, the concentration risk or the execution risk on just doing it, the hard way of decarbonizing through physical kind of decarbonization, may not occur in the timescales that you need, and sometimes taking another tool out of the toolbox, and carbon markets is exactly that, could be advantageous. So just some thoughts on Rene.
Yeah, Renee, if I want to build on that, I think the thing that I always come back to with any carbon pricing mechanism, and we're beginning to see this with the EU, is adding as much flexibility as long as you're maintaining the integrity of the framework of the mechanism as possible, right? So why is this important? There are many different types of fleet operators in the world. There are some that are very, very large, like a CMA, CMG, and there are some that are maybe only 100 or 150, 200 boats. And of course, there's going to be some cutoff based on emission profile. I'm sure there's going to be some rule set where if you're a little bit smaller, you don't have to abide by the rules, or you get a little bit longer. But I think the thing is, right now, particularly in a time where international shipping is a little bit more tenuous, is you want to have as little or as many kind of input commodities that maybe are ideally not correlated with one another affect an industry if you want to keep that industry affordable. So what do I mean by that? So right now in this new model, shipping is going to be now correlated, it's typically correlated with the cost of bunker fuel, and there's going to be lower carbon options, whether that's LNG or something else, right? It's going to be typically the larger organizations or larger fleets that are going to have a lower cost of capital that can actually afford to do the retrofit. So they're going to actually come underneath their allowance. Also, what's going to happen? What typically happen is the smaller fleets who might not be able to afford, who might have an overage because their cost of capital is higher, they're going to be the one who has to pay the tax, typically to the larger fleets, right? If they have basically they're coming under their kind of benchmark, they kind of have actually the emission reductions to sell within a carbon tax mechanism or cap and trade system, right? So it's all about the idea of you have a goal. If you beat the goal, you get to sell how much you beat the goal by. And what this creates is actually almost like a form of regulatory capture, or there's a risk that it could, where it actually kind of lets the bigger fleets get bigger and bigger, and it actually destroys the competition from the smaller fleets. Versus, you can imagine a world where you have two options. You could kind of retrofit and pay the tax, or you could buy a $50, $100, $150 carbon removal credit, and you could actually kind of essentially compete. And so as a result, you can make you have a little more optionality as a fleet operator. And that's something that I'm always going to be a fan of, regardless of the ecosystem we're in, right? You want to have as much optionality to business owners as long as the integrity of the system is maintained so that you can ideally, at the end of the day, keep prices low, right? Because again, all of this whole climate change, fighting climate change thing falls over the moment populism comes online, right? It all goes out the window. And so what we as folks who work within the climate change ecosystem ought to be doing is how do we keep prices as low as possible? And typically the way you do that is you don't give large organizations, you don't allow regulatory capture, you don't give kind of specific ecosystems any sort of monopoly or collective bargaining power, right? You have to keep things as competitive as possible. And so whether that's carbon removal developers competing with LNG suppliers, whether that's SAF suppliers competing with carbon removal developers, you want everyone competing down. It's going to keep prices low. That's good for eventually the end buyer or the end consumer. They can live a good life. And then as a result, they'll continue to vote for progressive policies in the long run, and versus maybe more populism-based policies when they feel like their life is worse and there's just all this collective work happening and it's unclear how it benefits them directly. So I think this is amazing. Like more carbon taxes, the better. But as we're seeing within Canada right now, I'm a dual citizen, American and Canadian, so I get two, front row seats going on right now in North America. Even Mark Carney wants to ask the tax. Well, why is that? It's because things aren't going super well for Canadians right now. And whether or not you believe that or not, that's the public perception. And then all of it goes out the door, right? And so it's super, super important that you kind of maintain the mandate of the global population to work on these problems. Otherwise, it kind of goes away. So I think it's amazing, but we really have to make sure that we're just not making things more expensive and the wealthy think, well, that's fine. It's what's a bunch of banana costs? $20. There's a couple bits of disconnected wealthy people. We have to kind of keep that in mind with some of these things. And shipping inputs are a huge driver on every consumer good, from car to produce.
Yeah, I love that, and some good sort of deep pulls there, and kind of a nod to the inspiration for this podcast, the All In podcast. Two I want to call out because I think that they're really relevant. I want to kind of talk about something you mentioned. So, regulatory capture, really interesting. And for those that haven't watched it, there's this like seminal presentation by a very well-known venture capitalist called Bill Gurley that he did, I don't know, a couple of years back, and he talks about regulatory capture. I'll add that in the show notes. But yeah, it's a really important kind of point, right? That sometimes at these unintended consequences that sometimes occur, or maybe sometimes it's by design when you don't have the flexibility mechanisms that you talked about inherently there that essentially create this regulatory capture. For folks that aren't so familiar with it, is that those large established players are now entrenched and essentially creates a barrier of entry for new participants. Just the hurdle is just too high, and effectively then you just get less and less competition within that industry. And what that means is that you just get less innovation and ultimately increased costs to the consumer. Whereas the alternative, decreasing those barriers of entry, creates the opportunity for 1,000 flowers to bloom effectively and competition to grow. And then that competition keeps everybody effectively honest and certainly harnesses as a force for innovation. So that's certainly that point. And then to your final one, which is kind of funny, is around the dislocation of a lot of people like, oh yeah, how much is a bunch of bananas cost? Like $20 or whatever. It's just kind of like, yeah, there's a lot of folks that live in these very deep kind of detached realities, whereas the rest of the real world, kind of the Wall Street versus Main Street kind of paradigm that's kind of very popular, or nomenclature that's very popular right now in kind of sort of social context in the US is evident. It's true. Not real people don't live in these contexts of being multi-millionaires or billionaires, and so they feel really the costs that are passed down in terms of these policies, whether they be carbon taxes or fuel levies, etc. They feel those costs intrinsically, and they see them. I think what's happened, and we look at the maillot jaune in France historically with regards to effects on fuels there, and you see revolts, politically that could topple governments effectively or change policy directions. I'm really curious in terms of how the world reacts to the increasing costs of goods and global as a result of this global trade order inversion, right? Tariffs are going to be inherently inflationary. And so if you go into your store and either you cannot get the goods because no one's buying them to bring them in to pay them the tariffs, right? Two things occur, like you can't get that good. So obviously you shift your behavior, but that's not necessarily that great if there's no alternative. Two, the government didn't actually generate the tax revenues that they needed. And then, the thesis is that it will spur manufacturing or whatever in country, but that's not necessarily always the case because the input costs have also increased. But anyway, we go back to geopolitics. But yeah, just some reflections. It's cool.
We'll need another episode for those topics.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, very cool. Really well said, guys. Yeah, and I think I want to wrap up today's episode, I think, with one last question, right, for you guys. What is what are you most looking forward to within the VCM?
I lost you there, Eddie.
Yep, did you lose me?
Yeah, just repeat that. I lost your microphone for a sec.
So last question. What are you most looking forward to within the voluntary carbon market in 2025? And try, to make it less biased about, let's say Valterra or Patch, thinking from more of a maybe broader sense. But, feel free to, plug in, whatever you want in there, I guess. But what do you think?
Brennan, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when I reflect on what's coming up over the next couple of years, there's actually a lot of really phenomenal technological pathways that are beginning to get to pretty meaningful scale. And at the same time, we're beginning to see a little bit of creative destruction as well. And so what I mean by that is I've had both 3 or 4 project developers in the last quarter that were selling volume on Patch go under. And so we've actually helped support our clients kind of reallocate their capital and kind of diversify away from that. And at the same time, we've had several developers create some of the largest producers or largest facilities that have ever produced in the past, right? So whether it's Exomad Green in South America, bringing a very large development online. We have a fellow actually just this week, a fellow Patch, a guy named Keaton. He founded a company called Holocene. His company just got bought by Occidental Petroleum. So really exciting to see kind of the 1.5 and Holocene low, essentially it's like low energy or low temperature direct air carbon capture. So the techno-economic analysis and the kind of carbon balance of it is far more favorable than maybe a more traditional Climeworks or carbon engineering type model. So really excited to see some of that new technology get scaled with the with kind of the lower cost of capital than Occidental Petroleum has. And so I think it's actually a lot of really exciting kind of what I would describe as like not industrial scale, but scale up stories on the technology side that are becoming real businesses, right? We only might be 5, 10, 15% of their revenue, but then they're doing 10, 15 million a year just to Patch some of these technologies. And so on the other side, it's probably on the scale of 50 to 60, 70 million bucks a year. Like that's a real business that didn't really exist 5 or 6 years ago. So that's really exciting to see some of these small organizations that were a budding startup like we were in 2020 start to become real companies.
Cool. I like that. Yeah, interesting. I mean, you just called out a story that actually came out on the wire actually last night or today, right? Around Oxy basically adding Holocene to their DAC portfolio, and so I like it. But I'll answer your question, Eddie. For me, it's a few things. Firstly, the emergence of it's kind of similar to Brennan's point. Project developers actually starting to hit their stride, essentially, and I'm really sort of buoyed by the potential of the scale that a lot of these new entrants have basically announced in terms of their ambition and are actually starting to realize. Obviously, we work with a great client called Verity Nature, and they're bringing to market potentially hundreds of millions of tons of high integrity nature-based removals over the next 20 to 30 years. And that's really great. And I see really a receptive audience with regards to both offtake on the corporate side and also in terms of the financing side. And that also applies to biochar. I think you mentioned earlier, the Exomat Greens of the world, but there's a number of others who are sort of coming up in that space. And I think that biochar is certainly having its moment. So that's that. The other thing is, so there's 3 points effectively. 2, I think that there's this incredible opportunity for our market to continue to attract really motivated and driven young people, and we use that as a force for harnessing and growing our industry broadly. So the emergence of the next generation is the second one. And I think I point to Singapore, where I reside, and certainly the emergence of the Carbon Academy at Nanyang Technology University. I'm really fortunate to be teaching one module, and hopefully now soon we'll announce a second module that I'll be teaching as part of that course. So that's really great, and that's kind of my pay it forward piece. But I really am buoyed by the next generation and their energy and their kind of coming in. And then I've lost the third one, so that's it.
All good. Yeah, well said. Well said. I think I think I should just throw briefly mine in there. I'm most looking forward to the mainstream integration of high integrity frameworks, and ultimately that is leading to more corporate sustainability action, which is what I think that the industry needs the most, right? And we're seeing that from a lot of leaders and big tech companies here in the U.S. driving down prices for these CDR technologies. So I think that's one thing I'm very excited to see is the integrity frameworks alongside with corporate sustainability uptick in the market. So yeah. With that being said, I want to thank Brennan for joining us today. That was a great discussion. Really appreciate your time. And that's a wrap for this episode on This Week in Carbon. Be sure to subscribe and share. Check out the full episode. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.